there, everybody. I'm Liz Weaver. I'm a Vice President with the Tamarack Institute, and joining me today are three collective impact practitioners, Mary Pickering of the Atmospheric Fund, Elena DiBattista of the Halton Our Kids Network, and Cathy Wright of Living SJ. I wonder if we could put up the slide with their pictures so everybody can see them. So I just want to introduce them really quickly. Elena DiBattista is the director of the Our Kids Network in Halton. Elena has an extensive career in human services field and has been the director of the Our Kids Network since 2010. In 2013, OKN adopted a collective impact framework. Elena's leadership in engaging key partners and community agencies to work together has enabled the OKN to develop long-term commitments from different sectors to a common agenda and a shared vision for change to meet the needs of children, youth, and families in the Halton region. Mary Pickering has been with the with the Atmospheric Fund since 2004. As Vice President, Programs and Partnerships, she leads TAF's multi-sector collaborative initiatives and oversees design and implementation of TAF's grant-making and urban greenhouse gas reduction programs. It's a little hard to say, Mary. Finally,
you did well.
Oh, thanks. And finally, we have Cathy Wright. Cathy Wright is an advisor with Living SJ, a dynamic network of leaders from business, government, nonprofits, and low-income neighborhoods. The urgency to move the needle on child poverty pushed the St. John community to adopt a collective impact approach with a focus on 4 game-changing priorities: education, neighborhoods, health, and employment. Cathy advises the growing network as they build relationships, align actions, and constantly learn and evolve to achieve results needed to end generational poverty. As a professional and a volunteer, Cathy has contributed to changing social issues at the local, provincial, and national levels. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks, Elena, Mary, and Cathy.
You're very
We
welcome.
really wanted to talk about collective impact from a practitioner perspective. And so what we know is that collective impact is transforming communities across Canada and the United States. We know that the work can be challenging, particularly when we bring many diverse partners together to agree on this common agenda and to really understand how to make and measure progress by using deep dialogue about what we agree on, but more oftenly about what we don't agree on. So our first question to each of you is to have you tell us a little bit about your collective impact efforts and just orient us to the work that you're doing. So Elena, if we could start with you, that would be great. And if we could move the slide to the Halton Our Kids Network, that would be great.
Great. Thanks, Liz, and thanks. I'm delighted to be here today. And as you're talking, Liz, I'm reflecting on the messiness of the work that we do, but the great value and momentum that the work can garner in a community. So thanks very much for letting me come on to talk a little bit about the Our Kids Network. And I want to focus on 2 pieces. I want to talk about the network and our vision and how we provide that backbone function around initiatives with children, youth, and families. But then I also want to talk about a specific initiative. So I'll go through it fairly quickly. So Our Kids is a long-standing network. We're over 20 years old. And we have a very broad vision and mandate. And the vision is all children thrive. So you can see how that really encompasses many, many issues and many areas of focus. We really look at kids from preconception to 18 and anything to do with those children and their families to really optimize their growth and development. 3 years ago, and we've been, moving along over those 20 years and evolving and growing and gaining momentum and had done some wonderful things. But 3 years ago, we adopted a collective impact framework. And we took about a year to adopt it because we really thought about it for a long time and really wanted to ensure that it was the right framework for us. But we realized that we had been working within a messier collective impact framework, and we had many of the components as part of our work. We had already identified a broad common agenda. We had established population results using an RBA process. We had established a good number of some common measures. We were focused on building relationships and partnerships and convening tables. We were focused on bettering the conditions for children, youth, and family. But what Collective Impact did, it provided us with a framework as well as a language to communicate the work, and provided us with an opportunity to do some intentional thinking around the role, both of the network, of our stakeholders, and in particular of what that backbone, very important backbone function was. So for us, Collective Impact really provided us with that clarity. Since more formally adopting the Collective Impact Framework, we've been more intentionally restructured. So we've restructured our whole, how we work. And if you ever have an opportunity to look at our org chart, you'll see that we're very big, messy, lots of different tables that we set, but we're really focusing on the elements of collective impact. And then it has also provided us with a much more intentional focus on measuring impact of that work. Within that work that we do on an everyday basis, and there's about 90 organizations involved with the Our Kids Network, we now set impact tables to focus on specific pieces of work. And I want to tell you about one of those initiatives. So we, in one of our communities a number of years ago, almost 3 years ago in Acton, it was identified by the principals of the 3 elementary schools, so it's a smaller community, that their children were coming to school not developmentally ready to be there. So there's a measure that they use, the EDI, and they knew that in that particular community, the EDI scores were significantly worse than they were not only in Halton, but across the province. And the principals had a very deep awareness that this was an issue that presented itself in terms of presenting challenges for those kids in grade 1 in those classrooms, but that the solutions and the possible engagement needed to happen before those kids got to kindergarten and got to school. So they came to our hub. We have a hub in Acton. They came to our hub coordinator that they had a relationship with, and that was key, and said, what can we do about this? So we've convened a table, and I'll tell you very quickly what they did. They brought stakeholders who was available and interested to the table, so they didn't wait till they had the perfect list. They brought them all together. They reviewed the data. We brought the data to the table around not only the EDI data, but their demographic data, their what assets there was in the community, and we started the discussion, and we set the data in the center of the table as one of the pieces for discussion, one pixel in the total picture. They reviewed the data and identified where they felt they could start. So they picked a spot. Was it the perfect spot? Maybe, maybe not, but it was a spot. So that's where they picked. They developed a plan, a short-term plan, because they weren't sure how this was going to work, and they went and they executed the plan. And very quickly after they were done their activities, they decided, well, that's just not enough, even though they had no indication of whether they had moved the dial on the EDI, which is the tool that's used. But what they did find is they were better connected in the community. They were much better able to work together. They were able to expand the parameters of their hats, of their respective hats, whether it was library or recreation or childcare or school, and they were better able to concentrate on that child and family at the center of the table, or those children and families at the center of the table. They've completed their work 3 years ago. They started, and they've continued to build on that plan and work. Based on the success of that project, and again, the EDI scores weren't in, but based on the success of the process and the partnership building and the ability and expanded ability of community to respond, we were able to get funding to bring that framework out to 6 other communities. And I don't want to say replicate, because that's not being replicated at this point. The core elements are, in terms of use of data, focus on relationships, focus on process, being really intentional about the discussion, staying on target and not drifting onto other things. That's continued and are the core elements, but we got funding to really go into 6 other communities. So at this point, 3 of those tables are up and running. They were regionally selected, people with a regional lens, but they are locally planned and implemented. We're bringing, again, local data to the table. The areas of focus are a little bit different in each of the communities, but each community then is able to come up with community-based solutions. Their evaluation that's happening at this point is both on the anticipated outcomes, EDI scores in particular, but also on the process and building community cohesion, building community partnerships. And I want to just say how important it is to evaluate and pay attention to the process so that you don't lose momentum and you don't lose people as you move along. So I think I'm going to stop there, and maybe you can go to the next slide and the next presenter.
Great, thanks, Elena. I think what's really interesting about that story is that while you had minimum specifications for all communities, you certainly allow the local context to also come into play. So that's a really interesting story. So Mary, why don't you tell us about the GTHA initiative and about TAF, a little bit more about TAF.
Sure, thanks, Liz. I'm working for the Atmospheric Fund, or TAF as we call it, and this is an agency that's affiliated with the City of Toronto and now with the Province of Ontario, and our role is to incubate innovative action to help reduce greenhouse gases in cities. So we have a very specific mandate. We are a funder, we are a lender, and we are, I guess, maybe a little bit of an agent of change, helping to develop new ideas and projects, sometimes within our shop and or through support of other groups in the community. And this is how Move the GTHA came about. We had some history with Evergreen, which is an environmental organization, and we were concerned about the problems we have with transportation in the region because it's a major source of greenhouse gases from our very narrow perspective. That's what we're concerned about. Evergreen was positioning itself to become a new force. They wanted to build skills in bringing together different groups to be an innovation lab. They felt that new ideas were needed to address sustainability issues in the region. And we decided together, we gave them a concept development grant to test how they might be useful as an innovator, and they decided that they thought they could bring together a group around a collective impact group to help drive the transportation investment in the region. So just at this time, we were heading into a provincial election. It was going to be a pivotal one. Many groups were concerned about the fact that the regional transportation plan, which was already developed, had no corresponding funding plan. And a lot of groups were beginning to develop campaigns in advance of the election. So there was a pivotal point there that was creating an opportunity for groups to speak. And instead of having each of these groups speak individually, we held a meeting, and this picture on the slide is September 7th, 2012. We held a meeting to see if these different groups might consider working together in tandem to amplify their voices, to develop common messages and amplify their voices. Otherwise, we were concerned that, you know, they weren't going to be heard as individual agencies quite as loudly. And what was interesting about this group is that it really ran the gamut from in terms of sector. And they weren't there for the same reason. The Board of Trade was there because they just released a report that showed the productivity losses associated with their goods, their members' goods being and staff being stuck in traffic. The Nurses Association of Ontario was there because sedentary behavior associated with commuting in cars is driving diabetes and inactivity-related disease. And other health agencies were there for similar reasons. Environmental groups were there because of the sustainability issues and pollution issues associated with transportation. And we also had labor at the table who were, you know, concerned about, you know, opportunities to, they were concerned about access to equity, access to transportation and other matters. So there was a number of different perspectives and reasons, but we did all want the same thing. And the groups agreed that they did want to work together, and so Evergreen received a grant from TAF to provide resources to provide backbone support to this group. And that's how the Move the GTHA was born. That was back in 2012. I'll just tell a little corollary before I go to the next slide. The corollary is the group is still together. We actually have morphed and changed our purpose because the election came and went. Actually, we're now facing and preparing for the 2018 election together, and we've done some very unique research together in the meantime, and some examination of our collective impact group by external assessment people, evaluators, to learn some lessons, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But if I could have the next slide. I just want to talk about the shared principles. I think, you know, this is a very important aspect. This is what brings us together. There was no way this group could agree on how the money would be raised to pay for the transit that was unfunded. There would be no agreement among this group, and that became quickly apparent. But what we could agree was that we felt that new revenue was required, that existing funding within the government was not enough to support this work, and we were able to establish a set of principles with respect to how the funding should be developed, like what was it, that it was fair, that it was efficient, that we had transparency, that it was actually dedicated to transportation, and so forth. So this is a very strong set of principles, and it served us well because this was a fast-moving file, you know, different decisions coming at the city and the provincial level over several years, and every time we wondered to ourselves, is this what, do we agree to this? Can we speak together on it? We referred back to this set of principles to really help us understand whether the new proposals or whether the issues of the day were in compliance with our shared principles. So this was a pivotal tool. And I'll just stop there for now.
Great, thanks, Mary. I think there are a couple of things from your comments around, you know, the role of the Atmospheric Fund as creating this container. We often refer to it as a backbone, but the container to bring people together. And I do really think that, you know, in one of the lessons that we've learned at Tamarack around collective impact is that there's real value in identifying shared principles. So thanks for sharing those. Let's move on to Cathy and hear about the Living SJ story. Cathy?
Great, thank you. Just to set a context, we were just recently at the National Poverty Forum when business engaged in Hamilton, and St. John has a population of about 70,000, and we decided we're like a small Hamilton. So it gives you a context of the size of our population, but also the issues that we're dealing with. So we've got, as you can tell by the chart, we've got a long history in looking at poverty reduction, and we've certainly, you know, made some progress. You know, we've decreased in that period of time. We've decreased our poverty rate. We've learned that poverty is really focused on 5 very specific neighborhoods where the population is really predominantly individuals living in poverty. We've seen the business community come on board and stay with us. We got a huge shot in the arm when we became a vibrant communities in 2005. But our child poverty rate remains still unacceptably high at 30%. And we felt that we really needed to try to figure out what to do differently. And we also felt that poverty reduction was not seen at the same level as economic development. And so we needed to raise the bar and the influence around the issue of poverty. So probably in about 2012, we brought a group of the partners from Vibrant, from United Way, Community Foundation, Social Planning Council, Business Community, and the province and the city. There's about 11 of us. And we met on a regular basis to really think through what do we do differently here, and really adopting a collective impact approach where it really is all about how do you come at a complex issue in a different way that you've already seen from Elena and Mary's presentations. So we decided, let's look at that, let's see how that can move us forward, and we brought together a group of senior leaders from the community to pitch the idea of revamping what we're doing, rethinking it, use the collective impact approach, and roll out an engagement process. And so there was quite a bit of interest in doing that. And if you go to the next slide, I'll just tell you where we went from there. So we really focused on engaging. We did focus groups, community meetings, small stakeholder meetings to come up with a small number of priorities, targets for each of those priorities that we felt would take our vision of ending generational poverty and move it forward. And so we had the individuals that we pitched the idea to. They became a senior level leadership team and guided our process, and now are guiding our implementation. It also meant that we had to close something down. We had a roundtable and vibrant communities, and we moved that into being Living SJ and a leadership team. And what was the difference with the leadership team was, so not only did so instead of having the executive director of United Way, we had the chair of their board. And so everywhere we went, we had senior leaders, because we thought we got to have the top influencers at the table to help us move our priorities forward. And so the leadership team is all 4 sectors, so 3 levels of government, the nonprofit community, neighborhood leaders, low-income neighborhood leaders, and the business community. So just to say a little bit about each of the priorities. So employment, what we're trying to do is really connect individuals to employment through education and training, and really trying to look at models that give individuals not only skills, but also the soft skills and the connection to employment through social enterprises. With education, obviously it starts, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. It starts from, early learning to high school completion. And, one example similar to Halton is, except for us it was grade 2, is looking at understanding that the grade 2 achievement scores are the poorest in which neighborhoods, and of course it was in the neighborhoods where the incomes were the lowest. And how do we really rally the community around, as one example, to address that? So you can see education is trying to cover all aspects, but I just gave you a slight illustration. The third one is improve the health of residents through neighborhood models of care, and it's really taking a neighborhood approach, a wraparound service. We're starting with one neighborhood where, interestingly enough, the use of emergency room services for non-emergency rooms, emergency services, was extremely high. So again, trying to pull that data in to guide what we need to move it forward. And then the last one, interesting, after we did an in-house, we did a, outside evaluator after 18 months. And one of the things, recommendations was neighborhoods really need to be more front and center. So we put them in the center of our strategy, and really our whole focus is to engage the residents and to build their voice and leadership at the table. And so that's really started to make a change on how we move forward. So I think at that point I'll stop because we want to keep going. Yeah. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cathy. I think what's really interesting in terms of the Living SJ story is that you're doing work in the community around poverty reduction, but you recognized that it was time to pivot and to bring new leadership to the table and to refocus and re-energize your work. And we see this a lot around collective impact initiatives as well, that, at a 3 to 5 year or even longer period, you need to reflect and then see, is it an opportunity to pivot? And we also heard that a little bit in Elena's story and also in Mary's story. So our second question to the 3 of you is, what has been your biggest success to date? And so again, we'll start with Elena. Elena, tell us what the Our Kids Network has as success.
Okay, that's a tough question because there's so many things that we're very pleased about and very proud about, and then so much more work to do. But I guess on reflecting, when you gave me the question, I think for me it's the sharp focus on intentionality and focus on the work. I think that's really, really important, and that's come with continued engagement, but also with setting those tables to really knock out and decide on what is that common agenda, what is it that we want to be working on, whether it's at a network level in terms of our big picture pieces of work that we want to do, or whether it's at the neighborhood level with our impact tables. So what is it? So that focus, that conscious focus on intentionality and reviewing and having a look at. So, you know, Liz, your comment about collective impact initiatives tend to, you know, do a little bit of a rethink, rejig, perhaps do a course correction, and that for us has been incredibly helpful and incredibly impactful in terms of the work. The other piece that really ties into that is, as you're having that discussion, the sense of ownership spreads across the stakeholders, so that there is no one person holding that banner, one person holding that issue, that the ownership spreads across, and that comes with, you know, continued discussion, continued intentionality, looking at that data, figuring out what everyone can do, and stretching those boundaries. So for us, that's been the biggest success.
Great,
Next
thanks
slide.
so much. Mary, what's been the biggest success for TAF?
I really appreciate what Elena said, that, you know, what we've done here, I think, is create some new relationships among diverse groups that wouldn't have existed before, and we see that some of those groups have, bounced off into other projects. There's been follow-on effects to work together and to combine their forces in ways that creates messages. And I guess the success there is that it provides more, in our case, more political access. It keeps the issue alive because decision makers can see that this is not some kind of niche environmental issue, which is something that our sector often suffers from, but that it's an issue of much broader public relevance. And they're hearing that because they're hearing amplified common messages from diverse groups. And it has given us the opportunity to go directly into government to provide our concerns. And that's been a real success. Creating the relationships, also really important, and it's built capacity to work this way among different groups. And from our external evaluator, we know that people have learned new things that they've taken back into their own shops and used in a number of different ways. And I think that's quite important. I'm sorry to say that we still don't have the money to pay for transit in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So on that front, we continue to fail. However, I think that this is a long play, and that this social infrastructure we're building continues to be quite important to part of that solution.
In some ways, you're failing forward, which is always not quite failure. It's kind of like, let's just keep moving forward. Thanks, Mary. Cathy, what about you? What has been successful in this kind of reorientation of Living SJ?
Well, I think I would look at two areas. One is seeing groups work differently with a specific purpose. So for each of our priority areas, we have a collective impact team and, of course, some sub-teams. And so that's a growing network of about 120 that are involved in the actual moving those priorities forward. But we've seen, the schools rearrange resources differently to add more resources to the schools that are most challenged. We've seen the city sign 3-year service agreements with our neighborhood organizations. We've seen United Way and the Community Foundation use those 4 priorities to guide their investments. The second area is growing influence, so really trying to get at where decisions are made at all levels. And I think having the business leadership with us, not only do they inspire and challenge our own work, but they also are connectors to senior levels of government. Like to really, we've had deputy ministers down meeting with our initiatives in St. John, and we've gone up to Fredericton to meet with them. And I think that's really starting to move it forward, where it's so much easier for communities to be the innovators than it is for government. I think the voice of neighborhood leaders, really being at the table, talking to ministers, talking to deputy ministers, goes a long way in the message that it sends to low-income residents. And I think for us, I have to say, having an MP that champions us, up the yin-yang, our community, St. John being a case study, has really helped put us on the map, as well as all the coverage that Tamarack gives us. So that, I think, is helping us with our growing influence.
It's really interesting, right? The three of you have shared your successes, but if you think about collective impact as best, it's dealing with complex issues for sure, but what it's trying to do is to shift and reshift policy systems and environments. Each of you have said, you know, in your successes, you've identified or articulated how policy has really come into play, both if it's at the local community level, the fact that actors are working more intentionally together, but also policy at, you know, other levels of government, whether it's local levels of government or provincial or even national levels of government, and then the realignment of funding and resources, right? That's kind of a systems change. So it's interesting to see how collective impact is less about programmatic interventions and more, in your examples, about how the system is shifting and the work of the collaborative is really making a difference there. Really, really interesting. I'm going to go on to our final question that we have before we open it up to questions from our listeners. And the final question is, if you had one piece of advice to give to others that are engaged in collective impact work or thinking about launching into a collective impact initiative, what would that piece of advice be? So, Elena, do you want to launch us off?
Sure, and again, you know, it's hard to pick one piece, but for me, it's to have a very clear understanding about the backbone function, whether you call it backbone or whatever else, but really looking at what are some of those components, really bringing the research, convening those tables, focusing on policy, because I think, you know, you did a great job, Liz, of kind of wrapping up why this work is so important and really getting to the policy and ensuring that we have politicians engaged in some way or another. So for me, it's a clear backbone role, and to do that, there has to be some clear vision and intentionality about how you do that work, but you also have to focus on time. This takes time. This takes time to have those discussions, to really have a look at what you're going on, what you're wanting to focus on, and what your priorities on, and that's really important. The time issue is one that we often don't pay enough attention to. And not that you have to set a table and talk on forever, but certainly that you have set a focused table with a good agendas and some really focused discussion. And within that time, it's looking at how your process moves along to, you know, focus at the beginning on some small and short-term quick wins so people get engaged and excited and the momentum starts. Take lots of time to build relationships, so look at relationships that are there. But also look at relationships that aren't there. So you bring both the usual and unusual suspects to the table, and you build those relationships, and you're able to help people understand what they can bring and what assets and pieces that they bring to the table and how they are part of that puzzle, but more importantly, they're part of the solution. You know, so again, the time for discussion, the time to test things and figure out what works and what doesn't, the time to ensure that there's some kind of an evaluation process, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to answer the question, is our community better off, and how is it better off? And the only way to do that is to really measure and have some things in place. So for me, that's a big one piece of advice. Get started, absolutely. Have some quick wins, but certainly take some time to do some of that thinking and talking about and intentional focus on where you want to be, and how that for us, how the collective impact framework has really helped us with that. On the other side, you know, it's a piece of advice is around the funders, because so often when you go to a funding body, whether it's local or provincial or federal, They're very much focused on program, and this kind of work is, yes, you can have some projects and programs, but it's bigger than that, so that it's building those relationships also with funders and policymakers to have the discussion about and tell those stories around what's working in your community, what has impact in your community, and why it has impact. That's been really important for us, and those relationships, I think we often see them as us, funder of community, and funder over there somewhere. But I think we have to really focus on that they are part of the bigger picture as we're wanting to move forward with whatever our area of focus is. So I think that's really important. So it's a whole rethink of how we view funders and how we engage, and maybe pushing back a little bit about the parameters around program funding, but really having that discussion. So that's my one big piece of advice.
Great. So backbone and funders are two things to really pay attention to.
Exactly.
Mary, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with the former points, for sure. And I think I wanted to just talk just briefly about the fact that we did take some time to create a case study, just like Elena was saying, about this work, because we do want to share this with other funders. We're a funder ourselves and work in a funder network. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what happens under the skirts of collective impact. What's going on there? What is the money spent on? What are people doing? What happens when you don't agree? And this report is, we call it a narrative report, helps talk about that in terms of the Move the GTHA case study. We also developed together with the full group a list of 10 lessons, which I won't go through right now, but they are on page 13, and this report is on the TAF website, or I'm happy to send it around. But the one lesson I want to focus on right now really has to do with capacity. This work is difficult, it's tricky, it's sensitive, working across different sectors, takes a lot of skill and finesse in order to build these common solutions. I think we need to understand that when we enter into this work, we need some seriously skilled people to help drive it. And as a funder, I'm looking to see how we could help practitioners improve their skills, but I think it's really important to look for resources. They can be as simple as having critical friends, peer support, get together after the meeting saying, gosh, how did that go? And I think we've got, somebody's got some issues, and what are we going to do? And, some peer support right through to building facilitation skills. Also, Elena talked about evaluation. That's really important, and it has to start from day one and has to continue, because this is change-making work. We need to be checking in. We need those developmental evaluation skills. I want to say, Tamarack obviously is that's why, for me, it's such an important resource, because we can come here and we can discuss together and have that peer support and all the literature and findings that Tamarack provides. I also have undertaken myself and have provided support to others in the community, the partnership brokering support, which is designed to help work with very diverse partners, and I think that's also helpful. In there is probably a lot of others, but I think this really is a skill set. This is not something that's just casually done, getting a bunch of people together. It's not simply convening. It's a lot deeper, and we really need to understand how to support the capacity to do this work well.
Thanks so much, Mary. Cathy, what is your advice?
Yes, and just really picking up on what Mary just said about how hard the work is, where there's no roadmap, just signs, paths, and people. My advice is don't do anything alone, and it's for two reasons. One is it really relates to that mutually reinforcing component of collective impact, and many people have heard of Alet Mansky, and his point is, our issues are so deep and complex that if we want to be innovative, it's really got to be on the way we work together. And I think it's really on building the ownership with your partners so that you really can influence change happening. So it's not working by yourself for two reasons. One's to build the ownership with others, from all sectors. Each sector is very important. And the second one is it helps to overcome the we versus you. You know, that Living SJ is not you guys, what are you doing? Living SJ is we, it's us, and it's really people sharing in the ownership of what we're trying to do moving forward. And I think a component that helps with all that is learning, that really continuous learning is so important to our work. And I've often said is that with collective impact, it's all about doing things differently, and if each of us don't feel that we're working differently, then we know we're not going to bring about change.
So thanks, Elena, Mary, and Cathy. I think that's wise advice, really considering the backbone role and functions and the impact that has, the questions around funders and building different kinds of relationships with funders. And I think you reinforced that, Mary, in terms of your role as a funder convening a broader stakeholder table. I'm sure you had lots of lessons that you learned in that as well. The idea of building capacity and building ownership. Those are really important pieces of advice. I know I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie now. I know that Stephanie has a couple of questions from folks that are listening in to our conversation. And so, Stephanie, maybe you can take over from here and lead us in a couple of questions.
Yeah, sounds great. We actually have more than a couple. They've been just flying in. So I'm going to try and lump a couple together so we can get to as many as possible. So the first question comes from Rose Anderson Rice, and she's wondering if all three of you had to identify early wins, what would those be? And then I'm going to add a second part to that question that came in from Angela Huang. Our collective impact community has a hard time looking at intangible, short, quick wins. What piece of advice do you have for backbone staff to help change that mentality? So some of your early wins and then some advice to help change mentality. So maybe we'll go the same order, Elena, Mary, and Cathy.
Sure, and I guess when I think about this, there's a number of things. So let me talk about, an impact table. So early wins, and it kind of rolls into change mentality. So early wins at our initial EDI impact table in Acton looked to be challenging at the beginning. We brought data to the table and we were talking too much data, too much research ease, right? So we had to really go back to the drawing board and talk about how to make data accessible. And once that happened and we could get down to a granular level of the data where people could see, oh, here's one area that I can make a difference in. Early wins became, once we got there and the light bulb started going on for people, it became really easy. So that the win at the very beginning was coming up with a plan, that initial plan, and then executing it where everyone pitched in, and everyone pitched in beyond their boundaries of their sector. So for example, we had recreation sector getting us money through some recreation funding for a component of the project that they had no part in, but they felt they were championing it for us. They would never have done that before, right? So really getting down to a level of a discussion where people could see where they could have an impact and they could have a buy-in. So for us, that's how we get to early wins. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but that was a real aha moment for us in terms of making sure that you made the research accessible and that you stay up in terms of what you want to do, but get down to the granular pieces so that people could see what they can do and what they have some power over doing.
Yes, I think this is a really important question because sometimes the stuff we're working on has a very long, it's a very long road. I would say that the types of early wins you can get are, for one thing, establishing shared principles. Also, doing something together. I feel we're an incubation agency at TAF, and what really satisfies me is just picking out a project and working on it together. There's no better way to get to know colleagues or partners in a group is for you all to be shouldering something together, and also people starting to get behind projects they didn't initiate themselves alone. And this is sometimes a very new type of way of thinking. They've got to talk their organizations into everybody getting behind somebody else's campaign and not everybody doing their own thing. We tend, I think especially maybe in the environmental sector, there's a bit of a problem. We have a lot of rugged individualists, and so getting people to do stuff that they didn't initiate is important. And how you can capture that, I think I spoke about evaluation, developmental evaluation, how you have to begin that at the beginning and set yourself some milestones, short-term milestones, and monitor your progress and celebrate that with your group. And I think that's a very important practice to keep people understanding that, you're taking, with a long-term goal, you're making progress every day, and you're creating value for the members of your group.
And sorry, just to add to that, Cathy, I think for us, as I think it was Elena who said, having the strategy in place was huge, because that really reflected, 2 years plus in the works, and knowing that there were a lot of people who were committed to moving it forward. I think for us, having individuals that were prepared to be co-chairs of our different teams, so that, for example, for our education group, it was, a senior business leader and the superintendent of the school district. So already it sends a message that this is important, change needs to happen, and we're at the table. And so I think those things were really important, because I think people really fit this into their jobs, and the more that they got involved, the more commitment that actually that came. For example, our health district was very involved, and we really wanted them to be the backbone support for the health team, but it took time, and then it happened, and it's made a huge difference, because all of a sudden it's got them thinking differently about what we're trying to do.
Great, thank you guys all so much for that. I'm going to try and lump together 2 more questions, and these ones are actually specifically for Elena. So the first one comes from Joanne Cogan, and she asks, who was at the table, so i.e. parents or etc. And then the second part of this question is from Michelle Calusi, and she's wondering how long it took Halton to move from that first convening of stakeholders, in your example, to the point where you were ready to take some action.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that we're talking about the impact tables that we're setting around EDI. So I'm hoping that I've interpreted that question properly. But I can tell you that it didn't take long because the relationships were already in the community. So I think I mentioned that the principals of the 3 elementary schools went to our Acton coordinator, who's been in that community for almost 10 years. So the relationships were established. It would have taken a little bit, quite a bit longer probably, and a little bit different work in terms of building those relationships. But we convened, and as I said, who was interested, who came to the table, right? So, for example, it was childcare, Parks and Rec, I believe library, we were there, education, of course, was there, the Y was there. I'm trying to think who else. We have parents engaged at the parent council level in terms of supporting. We didn't have them engaged at the beginning, and that's something that we're trying to build into the tables as we move forward, because we know that's really important, and it became important in Acton, so it is now. Sometimes police are involved at our other tables, at our other three neighborhood tables. It just is, again, who is in that neighborhood, who's doing some on-the-ground work. Health, of course. Sorry, I forgot health. I knew I'd forget someone. So those are some of the players. But it could be, and it is at some level, sometimes it's the service club. In Acton, there's a church that's very involved that comes and parachutes in and out, right, of the table in terms of where they feel they can have an impact. It could be a Boy Scout troop if you're wanting to do something, right? It could be a very small local organization. So it's whoever is in that area that has, and for us, we're talking children, youth, and families, and really everyone has a stake, right? So we bring them to the table. Our challenge sometimes is business, but with a more focused with a real neighborhood-focused initiative, it's a little easier to get business to the table. They can see where they can contribute. They can see where they can make a difference. They can see where it may align with their philosophy, whether it's a family-run business or a big corporation, right? So I don't know, have I answered both questions?
I think you have, yeah. Thanks so much. I think we might have time for one more question for all three of you. So the one I'm going to wrap up with is from Rose Anderson Rice, and she asks, in terms of continuous communication, what was your process for keeping everyone informed, those at the table and those in the community? So maybe we'll start with Mary and then Cathy, and then we'll go back to Elena to give you time to catch your breath.
Thank you.
Yes, this group met by telephone either every 2 weeks or sometimes weekly if there was a lot of activity. And it was a regularly scheduled call for an hour. Evergreen was the facilitator and created the agenda. And every quarter or so, as needed, we also had a strategy meeting, which might have gone for 3 to 4 hours, where we worked together on something. For example, we might have jointly purchased a communications advisor to help us develop joint messages, or a government relations advisor to help us orient our work, or other like that. And so there was some strategy shaping in person on a periodic basis.
And this is just Cathy here. I think that's a communication, which of course is continuous communication. One of the 5 collective impact tenets is really important, and I think we're learning as we go. So we have a large network. We've got a lot of teams, but one of the things we realize is we brought co-chairs together of the different teams, and they want more of that, so that we're really looking at having a more integrated strategy, looking at kind of commonalities of concerns across all 4 issue areas. So yes, we have a website, newsletters, and things like that, but the other piece is really bringing people together. And I think we just recently had a meeting 2 weeks ago, and sometimes one of the greatest things about those meetings is people actually having time to share ideas and connect on a whole bunch of different levels. And so we're really trying to look at, how do we keep people informed, how do we work across the priority areas, and how do we give people a chance to continue to build that network for our community as a whole.
Yeah, and I echo what my 2 colleagues have already talked about. It's a continuing area of focus for us. Communication is so important. People need to know what each other is doing. They need to have opportunities, I think, as Cathy said, to meet face-to-face or on the telephone to talk about their projects, what they're focusing on. And to share information and share successes, but also share some issues that they want to, that they're grappling with. And I think for us, that often leads to sharing some commonalities. For example, we know that for us, parent and youth engagement has been a primary focus of many of our committees. So we are now tackling it as on an OKN-wide basis, where we're looking at a process, we're looking at have developed policies, and really are looking at embedding it. But each committee was tackling with it differently. Only when we brought them together and started to look at their collective work did we realize that this was a common issue across. So we found, we use newsletters, we use minutes, we have highlights of minutes, we tell stories, we bring people together once a year to talk about it. We have a collective impact planning table that has all the co-chairs on there. They meet monthly and they talk about strategies, and we try, always looking at ways, but it's a work in progress, and it's important work that really you can't let slide to the side of the desk.
Great, thank you all so much. Liz, before I just throw it back to you to wrap it up, maybe I will put you on the spot and ask you this one last question from Rusha Gadre. And she asks, can an organization have more than one collective impact project functioning simultaneously?
It's Elena. Maybe I'll start. Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah.
We do all the time.
Yeah.
It's difficult. It's not difficult. It's challenging in terms of keeping the balls in the air. Like, we are backbone for the broader piece. We have planning tables that don't necessarily have impact tables connected to them, or they can. Some do. So we have a number of projects on the go. It's challenging, but you really, as long as you're intentional and focused and keep to the mandate and what you want to be doing, it's really important to continue the evolution of the work. So yes, absolutely, you can have more than one collective impact initiative on the go.
Yeah, and this is Cathy, and I would agree. You know, our Living SJ network, our Living SJ is a collective impact network, but each of our teams, the goal is have multi-sectoral involvement targets, you know, use all 5 of the principles of collective impact. So all our steps are collective impact teams.
Okay, I'm going to flash an amber light on this question because I think you have to be extremely cautious. It depends on if you have anything else that you have to do or deliver as an agency besides being the backbone. And I think that we have to exercise extreme caution in deciding when the collective impact model is really needed to improve the outcomes, because it's extremely expensive in terms of time and effort to be done well. So I'm just flashing the caution sign there, and about selecting very carefully when we want to use this method.
I think that's wise, all wise words from all of you guys. I do think we have seen examples in collective impact of nested approaches to collective impact, where there is a kind of a super backbone that supports a variety of initiatives. But I agree, Mary, with you that it is about capacity, it is about time and expertise, and it is also about the context of your community and the context of the readiness of your community to support multiple collective impact initiatives. So those are all, they're really good points, and they're important to consider when you consider this question. So Stephanie, are you going to take us in the wrap up?
Yes, I will wrap it up. So in the interest of time and that we have 1 minute left, I'll get going on that. So a huge thank you to Elena, Mary, and Cathy for sharing your insights with us on the call, and Liz, of course, you too. And thank you all for your questions, and we'll be sure to circulate those around, and hopefully we can get some of those answered if they haven't been answered already on the call. So we'd also like to thank our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, the Maytree Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, the Province of Ontario, and Suncor Energy Foundation for making these calls possible. And as promised, in a few days, we'll email you with the links to the audio and other materials related to today's call. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack and let us know how we're doing. So I think we have one slide here about our upcoming event. And as you're all interested in collective impact, you'll be excited to know that we're hosting a 3-day workshop on Collective Impact 3.0, and we invite you to join us. The workshop will take place from May 9th to 11th in Kitchener, Ontario, and will bring together leading thinkers and practitioners of collective impact from around the world to accelerate the effectiveness of the evolving field of practice. The curriculum has been designed across 3 peer learning streams based on your experience in collective impact, and each day is structured to strengthen your community change practice, allow you to gain new insights into dynamic nature of community change, and to give you the tools you need to move to impact. This event is less than a month away, so if you're interested, visit the event website now, and please feel free to reach out to myself, Stephanie at tamarackcommunity.ca, if you'd like any more information. Finally, we have some other exciting events coming up, and we encourage you to visit our website, tamarackcommunity.ca, to learn more and sign up for our monthly e-magazine, Engage. So thank you again to all our speakers and for all of you for participating on the call. Have a great day.